the Gospel of Matthew. First, we're going to start with the exercise on slide 1. Look at Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. Why does Matthew's Gospel start with this long genealogy? Please pause the video here so you can answer the question. Why does Matthew's Gospel start with this long genealogy? Well, Matthew is showing us Jesus' Jewish heritage in this genealogy. He's particularly linking Jesus to Abraham and to David. He wants us to see that Jesus is both the son of Abraham and the son of David, with all that those titles imply. He seems to show us in his genealogy that the exile is now over with the coming of Jesus. And he links Jesus' unusual birth to some unusual stories involving women from his family line from the Old Testament: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Introducing Matthew's Gospel. Matthew is the first Gospel in the canon, the New Testament collection of books, although, as we've already said, it probably wasn't written first. It takes its name from Matthew, also called Levi, a converted tax collector who was one of the 12 apostles and earliest disciples of Jesus. The Gospel itself is anonymous. That is, we don't find the Gospel itself claiming that Matthew is the author. But early church tradition names Matthew as the author of this Gospel. So, for example, Papias, in around about 125 AD, just at the beginning of the 2nd century, writes of Matthew the Apostle being the author of the first Gospel. In fact, the early church fathers quoted this Gospel more often than any of the other Gospels. Matthew doesn't include a purpose statement in his Gospel, like John does in his, for example, where he tells us why he's writing his Gospel. So we have to look at the Gospel itself to see what his main themes are. And as we do, we see that Matthew is interested in the idea of Jesus being the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ, and in the idea of Old Testament fulfillment. He writes about Old Testament places, and he shows us that Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy, that he fulfills the law from the Old Testament, that he is the fulfillment of Israel itself. Matthew quotes from or alludes to the Old Testament many times in his Gospel. He shows us that the Old Testament anticipates the Messiah, that its themes are now fulfilled in the person and the ministry of Jesus, and that Christianity is rooted in the Old Testament. That fulfillment theme is probably most clearly seen in the repeated phrase, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet." The Gospel was probably written with a Jewish audience in mind, but with an understanding of the importance of the fact that the good news of Jesus is for all. Matthew ends his Gospel, remember, with the Great Commission, and therefore anticipates a mission among Gentiles, those who don't belong to the people of Israel. Have a look at the exercise on slide 2. What is the difference between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God? Please pause the video here so you can answer the question. What is the difference between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God? Well, they're the same thing. Matthew uses the phrase kingdom of heaven in his gospel when the other gospel writers use the phrase kingdom of God. That probably reflects his Jewish audience. Many Jews were reluctant, it seems, to pronounce the sacred name of God. And so they spoke rather of his location, heaven, rather than his person, God. Look at slide 3. The now and the not yet of the kingdom of God. The New Testament writers show us that with the coming of Jesus, we are now living in the overlap of two ages, the present age and the age to come. The kingdom of God is already dawned when Jesus came the first time. It's now, but the kingdom has yet to be consummated. It's not here in all its fullness. That will only happen when Jesus comes again. So there are aspects of the kingdom of God that are not yet here. That's what Matthew shows us. He emphasizes the fact that the end of history has arrived in the person of Jesus. Christians now live in this overlap of these two ages between Christ's first coming and his second coming. The evidence suggests that Matthew's Gospel was written before AD 70, before the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans. And it was probably written during the late 60s. The Gospel of Matthew presents the life and ministry of Jesus from his birth until the commissioning of his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. Matthew particularly likes that theme of discipleship. He speaks a lot about discipleship. He speaks a lot about the church. Matthew includes 15 parables in his gospel, 10 of which are only found here in Matthew. It's been estimated that 42% of Matthew's gospel is unique material. In other words, 42% of Matthew's gospel is only found in Matthew's gospel. What is the structure of Matthew's gospel? Well, see diagram 1 of your notes. Matthew's gospel contains 5 main blocks of teaching. Each of these blocks begins by placing Jesus in a specific context and then ends with the phrase, and when Jesus had finished saying these things, and then Matthew tells us what Jesus went on to do. And so the whole gospel alternates between blocks of story, narrative, and blocks of teaching. See the end of your notes then for an outline of Matthew's gospel.